My mom was born in Oak Lake. Born here in 1920. Wow.
Yeah, me too.
A good year. And 1920 was also the year that the English family came to Revelstoke from Ontario. Ken's dad and his twin brother Jim or George were 2 years old when the family came here. Their two older brothers, Jack and Dick, and then a couple of daughters that were born once the family arrived here. And they were living in the Lougheed Apartments, which is where Baruski Park is now. So, of course, the first thing that happened at that time every year, they were having annual municipal elections. And the mayor the previous year, and for quite a few years before that, had been Hector McKinnon. He was also the mayor several terms during the 20s as well, until he died in a fire on their Standard Dairy Farm in 1929. But in 1920, he decided not to run for the year, but Walter Buse was running. Walter Buse had Buse Drugstore and had been here since the 1890s as a druggist. And apparently there was no love lost between McKinnon and Buse. So apparently the previous newspaper issue, Buse had made some disparaging remarks about McKinnon as mayor. And so there was a long letter in the first issue from McKinnon refuting those and saying, Alderman Buse seems to forget he has left a few footprints on the sands of time, which do not indicate infallible government with Mr. Buse as the head. Does Mr. Buse think the people have forgotten when, as chairman of the Finance Committee, he voted to return Newman and Company their $10,000 marked check held by the city for the faithful execution of the work at the power dam and the completion of the same before the work was completed? And he went on to give a few other examples. So that was the first thing that was really the concern in the city, was who was going to be the mayor and councillor for the year. They were saying that there'd been a lot of snow and the sidewalks were in bad condition, and normally people would walk to the newspaper office to look for the announcement in the window of the newspaper office, but they were concerned that people wouldn't be able to get there. So they made an arrangement with the electrical department that once the election was determined, that the powerhouse would flash the lights in the homes of the city once if Alderman Connolly was elected, and twice if Alderman Buse was elected. So the street lights would not be affected. The little article said, watch for the flashes. So that's how you were going to know who won. So as it turned out, Alderman Buse did win. Before the election, they had a people's forum with a capacity audience of well over 100 people in the Scandinavian Hall, which had been the former Presbyterian Church. And they had 3 hours of speeches, and people actually came out and listened to 3 hours of speeches. They had different speakers as well as the local candidates. They had a local fellow speaking on Reconstruction in Canada after the war. That was still one of the things that was concerning people. And the previous Mayor McKinnon spoke and said that the city finances had improved the last year, and the year had closed with $7,000 to the good. So they were doing well. Mrs. Corsier at that time was the chair of the school board, and she spoke on the public schools of Revelstoke and really wanted to see more practical training for students in the community. So they had the election, and Walter Buse won as mayor. So they did 2 flashes. So he won with 235 votes to 188. And at that time, the city was broken up into 3 wards. So for Ward 1, they had A.N. McIntyre and E.A. Dixon. Ward 2 were Angus McLean and O.W. Abrahamson, who was a well-known building contractor. He built Mountain View School and the hospital and several other buildings in town. And Ward 3 was Sam Needham and W.J. Tomlinson. And they said it was interesting that there were 2 engineers and 2 conductors amongst the councillors, whereas before it had been more dominated by businessmen. School trustees were T.E.L. Taylor, W.B. Donaldson, J. Carmichael, Mrs. Corsier, and C.B. Hume. And they'd also elected police commissioners and the fire brigade chief. There were 2 fire brigades at that time. Number 1 fire brigade in Lowertown was Sam Needham, and the number 2 fire brigade chief was K.G. McCrae. So here's some pictures showing what the town looked like around that time. The very recognizable buildings that are still there. They were all constructed before 1920. This was an ad for, it was actually an ad for Manning's Chocolates, but they were advertising that they were carrying Nielsen's chocolate bars. Another, we've got a lot of the photographs. You'll see the caption, the credit from Emma Roberts. We have a photograph album that was donated by Emma Roberts back in the 1960s, and she lived here in the late teens and early 20s and took lots of photographs of the community. So I used hers for a lot of what the community looked like at the time. So some of the businesses that were in town there were, it was Barton's photographic studio, there was a land surveyor, Hobson's Bakery, Pratolini Brothers, General Contractors, F.B. Wells, had miners, loggers, and trappers outfitter. He was also a fur exporter. There was a taxidermist in town, a transfer business, City Transfer, 3 banks, the Imperial Bank, the Bank of Commerce, and the Wilson's Bank. There was Manning's Confectionery. There was 2 theaters, the Rex Theater and the Empress Theater, the C.B. Human Company General Store, the McCrae men's and boys clothing and shoes, Burns Company Meat Market, J.Q. McKinnon men's clothing, the Buse Drug Store, Sturdy Hardware Company, F.G. Buse, jeweler and optometrist. He was the brother of Walter Buse, the druggist. The Columbia Hardware, which had previously been Lawrence Hardware and was taken over by the C.B. Hume Company. There was McCarty's Garage, a couple of other garages in town, J. Romeo Shoe Repair, J. Middleton Contractor, Fred Young Dry Goods, a man named John Lee, who was a tailor and cleaner. So there was a lot of businesses in town. The population at the time was estimated at 4,100. And the newspaper actually said that some families were planning on moving here, but decided not to because of the difficulty in obtaining houses. Sounds somewhat familiar. One of the other big organizations in town at the time was the YMCA. It had been built mostly with railway money back in 1906. That was located where the city parking lot is now on 1st Street East. And it had a full gymnasium, actually even a swimming pool in the basement, bowling lanes, rooms. So there was a lot of activities going on at the YMCA. There was lots of sports teams for men and women and boys and girls. They had a men's discussion club. This was in January and December. Subject Sex and Life by R. Ben Jackson, Secretary of the YMCA. All men invited, be ready to take part. This was YMCA Senior Girls Highland Dancers, 1920 or 1921. And the girl right there is Ruby Rutherford Knox.
Oh, yeah.
We do have the other names as well. I'd have to double check and see who else is in there. The Connaught Tunnel had opened in 1916, but at that time they were lining it with concrete. They said there was quite a lot of seepage in the tunnel, so they had a big contract that was going on. It took quite a long time to get to do that as well. But an electric plant for mixing huge quantities of concrete was installed by a man named Sidney Junkins, who had the contract for the work. And he had, his firm had built the terminals and Pier D for the CPR in Vancouver. So he had some experience in that kind of work. So the concreting had started some time ago, but the work hadn't proceeded far. They actually had to change contractors. And so that was ongoing. The Women's Canadian Club held dances at the end of January in the Scandinavian Hall with more than 100 people present, including many returned soldiers. They had two bands playing. The Revelstoke Dance Orchestra played the dance music with J. Guy Barber as floor manager, and they actually also had a jazz orchestra in town, and that's the first and only reference I've ever heard to the jazz orchestra in 1920. And they played a number of lively selections during supper. And the Women's Canadian Club netted over $80 to help them pay for the costs of the plaque to the fallen soldiers that they had erected at the courthouse. So by mid-January, they were talking about the upcoming ski competition, which happened in early February. And they had announced that they had gotten the world's professional ski jumping champion, Hans Hogan, to come. He had previously broken the record at Steamboat Springs, Colorado in 1919 by jumping 213 feet. And he was scheduled to compete in Revelstoke. And they were also bringing in a man named Steinwall, who was the champion from Norway. And of course, Nels Nelson, the local favorite, was the Canadian champion as well. The new council dealt with a couple of grant requests, one from a grant for $250 to the ski club. And that was carried unanimously, as they said it was to be used to advertise the event to outside visitors. And they also approved a grant to the Great War Veterans Association, just a forerunner to the Legion. And they had moved into the old hospital building where the Legion is now. That was the Legion until it burned down in the 60s. But they were asking for a grant to cover their water and light for a year. And the council was a little bit reluctant, but the previous council had done that, so they felt that there was a precedent and they would continue to do that for at least one more year. The ski club was raising money for their upcoming event, and they held a benefit on the Empress Theatre on February 5th to raise funds for their festival. That included vaudeville acts, picture program, and ski pictures, so moving pictures that were taken locally and included a lot of the local people. I've never seen any copies of those anywhere. It would be pretty great to see those. But the ski event was a big deal in town. These are photographs of the 1920 event taken by Emma Roberts. Some of her later ski photos are a little better. She was just getting the hang of it at this time. You can see the jump, which was the existing jump until the 70s. And they also had the 7-mile race, and they had a women's 2-mile race as well. There was an article in the newspaper in the issue just before the event that was titled "Flying Without Wings," which is the title that Rob Buchanan used in the little video that he did about ski jumping. And said, "Have you ever seen a man fly without wings? Why, a bird cannot do that. Come to Revelstoke, BC, February 10th and 11th, 1920, and you will see men soaring through the air without wings. Oh, an airplane, you say? No, no wings, no motor, no airplane. These strange birdmen carry their wings on their feet, and their wings are but a pair of boards strapped to their boots. The winged foot, you will remember, is the emblem of Mercury, messenger of mythological gods, and is emblematic of speed. Laws of friction and gravity, facts of angle and distance, all to be reckoned with and used to greatest advantage by skill, and finally the human spirit of courage and fearlessness, combined with athletic grace completes the beautiful and spectacular feat. The usual flowery language that you found in a lot of the newspaper articles there. But they were encouraging people to come. They were also encouraging people, they had a whole list of don'ts. One of them was don't throw snowballs. Don't allow a dog on the hill at all. I didn't see it in this paper, but I've seen other issues where they've said that if they saw dogs on the hill, they'd shoot them. So really, you did not want to bring your dog to the ski hill. It said don't get on the runway. Don't forget to put on plenty of warm clothes, as this is not a 1st of July picnic, a winter sport. Don't forget to put 4 bits in your pocket, as the ski club without financial support cannot exist. Also, don't forget to give that kitty of yours 2 bits for the gate. Otherwise, you will help to make him a criminal, as he is bound to steal him. They were closing the stores early on the days of the event in order to allow the local storekeepers to attend as well. So it was held on February 11th and 12th. Nels Nelson retained his Canadian championship with a jump of 185 feet. There were more than 2,000 people in attendance. The runner-up in the jump was S. Steinwell of Chicago with 181 feet, and he did win the 7-mile race as well. Miss Nan Nelson, the sister of Nels, won the Silver Cup in the ladies' special for best form jump. So they did actually let women jump on some of the boys' jumps as well. In professional jumping, Anders Hagen jumped 200 feet standing, taking the first prize, with Hans Hansen coming in second. Ivan Nelson won the first prize in boys' exhibition jump, and that was Nels Nelson's younger brother. After that event, Nels Nelson went on to compete in Banff and Calgary. In Banff, he scored the highest in Class A jumping. The newspaper was really not very impressed with the jumping facilities in Calgary at all. It was completely man-made jump there. Nels Nelson also went to Denver, Colorado, where he took first prize in amateur jumping, and Anders Hagen was first in the professional class. He also went on to Dillon, Colorado, and Steamboat Springs. Brennan Holton from Revelstoke also went to Banff and won the B jump, and Ivan Nelson won in the C jump class, the boys jump. There was a lot of closures in the schools at that time, around the end of January, even into March, for measles and flu and chicken pox. So there was a lot of disease going around. I didn't see any. There was 1 or 2 older people that died as a result of pneumonia from flu, but there wasn't the huge amount of deaths that had happened in the fall of 1918 and early 1919, when the worldwide flu epidemic had gone through most of the world, and there was over 35 people just in Revelstoke who had died in the flu epidemic. But they weren't taking any chances. They said that the flu strain didn't seem to be as virulent as the previous year, but they weren't taking any chances. So they did have closures of church and school and theaters for a period of time. Selkirk schools stayed closed the longest because there was a lot of measles that was going through that part of town and that neighborhood. There were quite a few, at least 2 or 3 businesses who were bringing in vehicles for sale at the time. In February, there was a new garage that had opened with W.A.P. Connolly and G.W. Bell, and they were bringing in Grey Dort automobiles. I hadn't heard of them before, but I'm sure some people have. Grey Dort was a Canadian automobile manufacturer from Chatham, Ontario, that operated from 1915 to 1925. You're not? Oh, okay. Thought for sure you would know who you are. But apparently there were a few Grey Dort automobiles in town for a while, at least 6 of them that were brought in. The local police chief, James Cleland, died of complications from the flu at the age of 39 in the middle of February. He'd been born in Scotland, was trained as a blacksmith, and he joined the Edinburgh Police in May 1900. He accompanied the King Edward on a visit to Glasgow and was presented with the King's Medal. He came to Revelstoke in 1909 and had been the police chief here since 1916. They also had a farm in the Columbia Park area, so Cleland Road is named after his family. So during his career in Revelstoke, he effected the arrest of a bandit who held up the Dominion Express office. Cleland was shot and wounded at the time, but managed to arrest the suspect nonetheless. He left a wife and 4 children when he died. So they brought in a man from Vancouver, W.W. Spratt, as the new police chief. And he had previously been part of the military police force in South Africa during the Boer War in early 1900, and had been the detective of the Vancouver police force for the past 5 years. In middle of March, it mentioned that 2 bad slides occurred during the week. There was a slide at Three Valley, which tied up traffic on the main line for a couple of days, and a slide at Green Slide, south of town, which wasn't cleared away for 4 days and affected the trains down to Arrowhead. There were heavy rains at the time, which were bringing the slides down. And of course, Green Slide is still an active avalanche path. The new police chief spoke to the council on several matters, including the collection of the dog tax. He stated that unlicensed dogs would be impounded and suggested that they be destroyed after 48 hours if not claimed. So it was pretty hard line. In the middle of, near the end of March, the local Public Library Association was formed. It was spearheaded by the Women's Canadian Club. They were hoping to sign up 200 members at $1 each, and that would help them to pay for the loan of 400 books from the Vancouver Carnegie Library. And they would be able to change the books out every 3 months, meaning they could bring in 1,600 books to the community in a year. They were also collecting books. They had book showers where people would bring good quality books to the library. So in a short period of time, the association had already they started with 150 books, which was the gift of the Women's Canadian Club. And in their first book shower, they had over 600 books donated. So they got off to a good start. The library opened on April 14th in an upstairs room in the City Hall, which is a different building, but in the same location where it is now. They were open from 3 to 6 p.m. on Wednesday and Saturday, and from 7 to 9 on Saturday evenings as well. The first librarian appointed by the board was Mrs. Archibald, who was a soldier's widow with 3 children to support. They'd had 12 applications for librarian. In the first month of operations, there was 496 books borrowed, and by the middle of May, they had over 175 paid-up members, so they got off to a really good start. There was a concern about the hospital, which had been completed in 1913, but they had a $25,000 mortgage. So the hospital board was wanting to put on a drive to bring down or eliminate the mortgage. And one of the things they realized was that there was $5,000 in outstanding debts from previous patients. So the first thing they did was try to contact all those people and try to encourage them to pay their bills. Of course, there was no Medicare back then. There was the board was also doing lots of charity events and drives to raise money. This was April 1st when they announced that they were doing this, and by June 24th, they'd raised $10,000 through their events. They managed to get, within the first month, they managed to get 1,000 of that $5,000 delinquent medical fees. The Revelstoke Automobile Club formed in April with 15 founding members, including the Chief of Police, Pratt, and who made sure that all of the people who were present knew the city and provincial rules of the road and the penalties. And the rules of the road were a little complicated at the time because in certain parts of the province, you had to drive on the left, and in other parts of the province, you had to drive on the right. They didn't get that fully sorted out until 1922.
So it's right-hand drive.
Yeah.
Luckily, there was only one lane.
Most of the time, there was only one lane. But you had to know where you were in the province. And at that time, they were discussing the speed limit for Revelstoke, which hadn't been set. But and they had colors for the club, blue and gold. The honorable president was Dr. W.H. Sutherland, and the honorable vice president was Alex McRae, who was sitting in the back of his family car with his young son at the driver's the steering wheel. Hopefully, he didn't actually let him drive. In April 8th, it was mentioned that a new business opened by Stanley Manning and Dan Crawford. They opened the Arbor Ice Cream and Confectionery Store. And it was interesting that Stanley Manning was a son of Horace Manning, who had Mannings. And it sounded like he was actually in direct competition with his father's business. So I'm not sure how that worked.
You know whether that would have been the same Manning that was the city clerk?
I think it was, yeah. So they probably didn't, I haven't seen, I don't think the business was in operation for very long. And then Dan Crawford went on to Crawford's General Store in Arrowhead. It said they were in the, what's now the WK Garden location. Said their walls were freshly papered and floors and woodwork was painted. They had a candy counter including leading brands of chocolate and confectionery. They were also selling cigars, cigarettes, and tobacco. The ice cream parlor had a capacity of 32, with 8 tables, including 4 box apartments. And they were making their ice cream on the premises. In middle of April 1920, 2 Chinese men, Wan Gar and Li Hoi, were charged with smoking opium, and they were each fined $50 in costs. Opium had just recently been declared illegal, and they were really going after the Chinese population over that. The defense lawyer for Wan Gar stated that he was using opium for medicinal purposes after he'd been severely beaten by an Italian man in Golden recently. But his excuse was not accepted, and as I said, they were each fined $50 in costs. This was an opium farm, which was located in Columbia Park, sort of on the point of which is now the golf course property. And it was they had sunflowers planted all around it to shield the opium poppies. It was it mentioned that every council for some years past had battled with the porch light problem. Sometime in the past, the city had agreed that they would provide free porch lights for everybody in the community. That had been going on for 8 years, and it was costing them money. So they wanted to discontinue it, but they knew it would be unpopular. So they said it was decided to disconnect all porch lights throughout the city, and applications would be available to have them connected to the meters at the consumer's expense. So they knew it was going to be unpopular, but they decided that they weren't going to give away free electricity anymore. So in end of April, this fellow put an announcement in the paper, called himself Professor T.R. Cuddiford. Not sure what his qualifications were to be a professor. Called himself a dancing master. And Miss Ruth Johnston of Los Angeles came to Revelstoke for 6 weeks to teach all of the latest dances. They said, if you can walk, you can dance. He guarantees in 1.5 hour lessons to make you a polished and graceful dancer. If you already have some knowledge of dancing, a half course of 4 lessons will be sufficient. Professor Cuddiford is recognized as one of the foremost interpreters of the modern dances in Canada. Now, this is interesting. They held a Remembrance Day on May 23rd, 1920. They celebrated Armistice Day on November 11th, but it wasn't connected with the remembrance of the soldiers at that time. It was just, it was a celebration of the end of the war. And I'm not sure how long that continued with remembrance of the Soldiers' Day being a specific different date. But in 1920, they had a Remembrance Day service at the courthouse. And it was in charge of the Women's Canadian Club, who had arranged for the erection of this plaque with the names of the soldiers who had died from Revelstoke and District who had died in the war. That plaque is still there. Even when they put the cenotaph up in 1923, they made the decision to keep the original plaque. There's a few discrepancies. There was a few errors, probably on both plaques, but they did decide to keep that one up. And quite a few of the families laid wreaths there at the time. And so there were about 40 returned veterans present. There was work started on the 19-mile stretch of the West Road, and because there was no road connection yet between Revelstoke and Sicamous, or parts west at that time. So they were hoping to get it completed by the end of the 1920 season. It actually didn't open until 1922, but they had some gangs at work. They said they had a camp had been started across the lake from Three Valley Station, and also one at Clan William. And it is expected that at least 100 men will have headquarters at each camp. In early June of 1920, Frank McCarty died. He was the first mayor of Revelstoke, died at the age of 67 years. He had come to Revelstoke in 1885 from the States. He and his wife were following railway construction across. They were actually providing meat and food to the camps as they came across, and they settled in Revelstoke. He had a butcher business. He also had opened a car garage as well. He was had interest in a lot of the local mining firms in the area, and was a shareholder in the SS Revelstoke steamboat. So it was a big event, his funeral. And this is his grave piled high with flowers. When I started doing cemetery walking tours, there was no marker for his grave. I'm not sure if there'd been one and it had been, vandalized or removed at some point. But on one of my walks, Ruby Cameron was there, and she thought it was kind of an outrage that her first mayor didn't have a plaque. So she went to city council and kept at it until they finally, the city finally did put a plaque on. And at the time we were trying to find relatives of the family, but weren't able to do that. But this summer, a relative, the grandson or great-grandson of McCarty.
Grandson, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we actually do have, and he lives in White Rock, Richmond, somewhere down there. So we actually have contact with a direct relative of the family now. But there is a plaque on his grave. We were able to use they have the plot map up there, but one of the other ways that we knew where it was is because of this plaque right behind it. It's a marker to the wife of E.C. Fromey, Mary Ellen Fromey, who died in 1906. It's a very distinctive marker, has a cross at the top as well. Fromey was a stone and brick mason, so I'm pretty sure he would have made that marker for his wife's grave. But look at the flowers, look at the size of these lilies. Just absolutely massive. There was a visit from a special train of Shriners who came from the east en route to Portland, Oregon. And they made a stopover in Revelstoke. They brought a 45-piece band with them. And so they did a little concert and a procession into town through the main streets. So they led several hundred nobles and their wives in procession about the main streets. And then they opened the Masonic Hall, which was right where Revelstoke Tire is now, opened that to local visitors and held a dance there. And they left by train the next day. One of the big events that happened, a real tragic event that happened at the end of June 27th, was when 4 people drowned in the Columbia River. And they were out on a boat near the Wing Dam. And this is the Wing Dam, which is still visible from Front Street. This is in low water. This is the fall of 1920. In the spring of 1920, it was high water, and the end of it was just barely visible. There was Walter Nelson, age 21, Bill Lawton, age 20, Muriel Armstrong, age 18, and Marjorie Cleland, age 14. And you might recognize the name Cleland. That was the daughter of the police chief who had just died in February. So they said they launched their boat from Bob Blackmore's boathouse at the end of the south end of Front Street. It said at 9:15 p.m., 3 distinct calls for help were heard by Mrs. Corsier and daughter Olga, whose home is adjacent to the boathouse. Their house is where the apartment house is, the apartment building. Said Mr. Corsier headed down to the old wharf where he met Dalton Allen. They launched another boat and tried to find the young people, but to no avail. Nelson was an expert boatman. It is believed that he attempted to pull the boat up over the dam, but the bow of the boat may have nosed onto the dam, swinging the boat around, enabling the swift rushing waters to hit the boat broadside on, overturning it, as it was later found upside down on the bank near the high school. And only one of the bodies was later found, that of Muriel Armstrong. This on the left is Walter Nelson. He was just 20 years old, but he was a returned soldier. He'd been a member of the 68th Battery of Artillery, and he worked with Bob Blackmore, who was an experienced boatman, running logs down the river to Sawyer's Mill. And he was an experienced rider. He was training horse riders during the First World War. That was one of his jobs. He was the son of John and Addie Nelson, who were well known in the Columbia Park, Big Bend area. His father had been a miner and prospector and packer going back into the 1880s. Bella Lawton was the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Lawton, who had the Victoria Hotel on Front Street. She'd been recently working as Molson's Bank as a stenographer. Muriel Olson was the son of Mr. and Mrs. John, or Armstrong, was the son of Mr. and Mrs. John Armstrong, and had been working in the home of Mrs. Alex McCrae as a house servant. And as I said, Marjorie Cleland, just age 14, was the daughter of Police Chief Cleland. A memorial service was held on July 4th, and this was at the south end of Front Street, and they erected a little memorial board there in memory of the following young people who were drowned near here, June 27th, 1920. And they also went on to the bridge, which was a wooden bridge 1 block south of where the Big Eddy Bridge is now, and threw wreaths into the river from the bridge. There were several hundred citizens present there. At the end of July, the body of Muriel Armstrong was found below Sawyer's Mill by 2 young men who worked there, Arthur Coffin and D. Parasini. At the end of August, the Cleland family had another tragedy when their home in Columbia Park burned to the ground. And after that, Mrs. Cleland and her remaining children moved to South Africa, where the family had been from previously.
Remember this summer we got a picture of Walter Nelson?
We did get a picture of Walter Nelson in the cloth in his uniform. Yeah. Mrs. Cleland's brother was John Malcolm, who continued to farm in Columbia Park for quite a while. Malcolm Road named after him, and we have his land is now part of the golf course. There was a note that the Glacier House was slated to open for the season on July 1st. They could accommodate 150 guests. That time it was managed by A.H. Devonish, who was also manager of the CPR Hotel at Sycamoose. It said the snow is gradually moving off the hills and the trails are opening. They would be having the Swiss guides at the Glacier House, along with 25 ponies and numerous driving rigs to accommodate tourists. The Glacier House, by that time, the Connaught Tunnel had been built, which bypassed, so the railway bypassed the hotel. So they were having to bring the passengers or the guests in from the Glacier station by horse and carriage. So within a few years, it was no longer profitable. It was torn down by, I believe, 1927. There was a man named J.W. French who was a CPR employee living in Kamloops, but he was also a noted Big Bend game hunter. He did a lot of trips into the Big Bend. He also was a known guide for other hunters that were wanting to go into the region. Quite a few years ago, we acquired over 150 photographs from his collection and a lot of his manuscripts as well. There's stories of some of his trips into the Big Bend. A lot of it is handwritten, so we're actually trying to transcribe it so that it's within a couple of generations, people who don't know how to read can actually access these documents. But he was quite a noted hunter. So it mentioned at this time, which was early July, that he had been on a 6-week big game hunt in the wilds of the Big Bend, accompanied by a guide, Leo Tennis, who was an indigenous man, probably from the Secwepemc Nation. Said they left for Golden May 1st, and from Golden they traveled around the Big Bend of the Columbia River in a 16-foot canoe, running the many treacherous rapids, and finishing their watery journey in Revelstoke. And on that trip, they bagged 9 grizzlies and 4 black bears. This is a picture of French and Tennis in 1920. Probably, his name was probably Tenise, but I haven't been able to find too much about him, other than he was related to Chief Kinbasket of Kinbasket Lake. But as I say, we've got these are the some of the least alarming photographs. There's a lot of dead animals in that collection. Did I miss a photo? Oh, there we go. I'm going to go there a little bit. Oh, sorry, no, I didn't see that. The park warden, Fred Maunder, reported that the auto road on Mount Revelstoke is now in good shape and open for traffic as far as the Duke of Connaught's post. And at that time, it still wasn't open to the top of that, to the summit. It was 1927 before it was fully opened. And this is Hector McKinnon and his family on Mount Revelstoke Auto Road. Maybe that's a gray Dort, because he was one of the people who bought a gray Dort that year. But I'm not sure.
Very damn good.
Yeah.
Spare tire mounted where the driver
I think that is Archie McKinnon. The girls are probably Mary and Margaret, and that's probably Jim McKinnon there. There was an article in July saying that Williamson's Lake was a popular resort. Said scores of people are to be seen most any day this summer at Williamson's Lake, which is said to be the best swimming pool in the district. A trip to this little lake, which is about a quarter of a mile in length, and which is reached in a few minutes by car, being less than 3 miles distant, reveals one of the finest little natural lakes to be found anywhere. There is 2 small streams flowing into it and one out of it, which guarantees clear water. But from the beach, the water is so shallow that it warms up fine for bathing purposes. Already a couple of swimming rafts have been constructed. Well, from the trunk of a large fallen tree, a plank has been attached from which the divers leap to deeper water. And of course, by 1930, the Rotary Club had taken over Williamson's Lake, and they're the ones who put in all of the original boathouses and the change rooms and the first docks and diving towers that were there for many years. This picture was taken by Emma Roberts in 1920, and the men are wearing their interesting one-piece bathing suits, and that's a woman sitting there as well. She has like sleeves, sort of mid-arm sleeves on her costume.
Yeah.
The city council was bringing in, was able to get some what was referred to as German war trophies. They had 4 captured machine guns, and then they were expecting a big German 77 millimeter gun. They were figuring out where to put it, so they eventually gave that to the Great War Veterans Association, who mounted it outside of the Legion or their building. There was a sad story. There was a man named Ernest Hester, who was age 41, who was a returned soldier, was found dead in his bed at a local rooming house. He'd been suffering from shell shock and was taking cocaine to relieve his symptoms, but not eating well at all. He'd been on road crews and B&B crews, but couldn't hold a job. Somebody had paid for him to get a room in the rooming house because he had no money. He'd been enlisted in 1914 and not discharged until 1919, so he'd served the whole duration of the war. And he'd been awarded a DCM for conspicuous bravery for bomb throwing at Festubert. But there was really no monetary relief for a lot of the returned soldiers. And the doctor figured that the amount of cocaine that he had taken because he wasn't eating properly was enough to kill him. So it's a sad story. That same issue of the paper, there was a letter from a man named Ed Stewart stating that his disability pension from the war service had been discontinued. He said that his discharge papers read medically unfit for further service as a result of service. But the pension review board said that it had been an existing disability, and they cut him off, and they said there was no that he couldn't grieve it, and he couldn't. He received a full pension up until February 5th, 1920, and then was cut off. So it was a lot of things that were happening. Is that 5 minutes or we're done? 5 minutes?
We have 5 minutes,
Okay.
I think. No one looks like they're in a hurry. To not interrupt the sad story.
The end of August note that Mrs. Roger had opened up a dry goods store on 2nd Street East opposite the King Edward Hotel. That's where the beer house is now. It was called the Bargain House. She was selling ladies, children's, and gents furnishings that later became Gail Jean Ladies Wear. There were a couple of visitors in town from the CPR. One was general passenger agent for CPR Vancouver, and the other was the general tourist agent for the CPR at Montreal. And the local mayor took them for a trip up the auto road on Mount Revelstoke and also along the Columbia Canyon Road. So both gentlemen were deeply impressed with the views and agreed that Revelstoke is an ideal point as a tourist center, and they agreed to promote Revelstoke as a tourist destination. There was also work done on the trestle at 7 Mile north of town. It said the Big Bend Road is now open for traffic again up to Silvertip Falls. Owing to a washout in the spring, the road has been closed for auto traffic throughout the summer, and tourists will be pleased to learn that this favorite run is now opened again. They also repaired the road from a slide at 12 Mile, and the Big Bend Road was open as far as 16 Mile. There were trails beyond that, but no roads that no cars could pass beyond 16 Mile. Of course, the road between Revelstoke and Golden, following the bend of the bend of the Columbia River, didn't open until 1940.
How do those people get up there?
Yeah.
Run and jump.
They climbed there.
Yeah.
And those are girls too. That's another Emma Roberts photo. So those are her daughters and her friend.
Photographer removed the ladder.
One of the things that was going on at the time was, well, there was a visitor in town, William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was the Liberal leader at the time, came to speak to a public meeting. He had a well-received audience, large audience there, and he was calling for an early election. And he did become prime minister for the first time in December of 1921. He held office until 1930, and then again from 1935 to 48. So he came here to speak in 1920. One of the big political things that was happening that year was a plebiscite provincial vote that was going on regarding prohibition, which had been in place since 1917. And they were trying to decide whether they wanted to continue with the prohibition system or go to government control of liquor sales. And both groups, the anti and pro, both had ads in the paper. The people who wanted government control were saying the bootleggers and illicit sellers of liquor are in league with the prohibitionists to defeat government control. A fine combination, to be sure. The present act is fine for the bootlegger, but rough on the man who needs a drop of liquor and knows when he has enough. Vote for government control. And that was, they were saying it was at the time to be on the voters list, you had to be a British subject, 21 years of age, have lived in the province for 6 months, and women could vote at that time because they'd been allowed to vote in the last provincial election. And then there was an ad to the women voters. For years, we have demanded the right to vote because we said we wanted to better protect our homes and children. Now it's up to us. What will our first vote do? On October 20th, we cast our first ballot on a provincial question. 4 years ago, the men banished the bar. Today, liquor, the arch enemy of the home and the children, threatens to return in the form of government sale. The women's ballots can stop it. Vote for the Prohibition Act. But when the vote result came through in October, it was reported on October 21st that the province went wet. Said every section of BC piled up a big majority for the ending of prohibition and the implementation of government control of liquor sales. Revelstoke voted wet by a majority of 115 out of a total of 922 ballots cast. Another big deal in Revelstoke in 1920 was the landing of the first plane. And this was a Trans-Canada flight. Although it was done in several legs across Canada, it was a first Trans-Canada mail delivery. And they were not scheduled to land in Revelstoke, but because of bad weather, they decided to land here. And guess where they landed? They landed on the Crow Farm, which is where the airport is now. So it was obviously the best place to land in this narrow valley on that farm. It was a big deal. Hundreds of people went out to see the plane. And the pilots were Commodore A.K. Tyree and Captain G.A. Thompson. And they had a big party for them at the home of the mayor that evening. They got away about 11:45 on the 15th, but could only get as far as Merritt owing to a severe storm. They eventually reached Vancouver on Sunday, October 17th. There was a couple of adventurers that had been traveling through the area, a man named Lewis R. Freeman and Len H. Roos, who was a filmmaker representing the Chester Outing Pictures Company, were in Revelstoke on part of their trip along the Columbia River. They'd started at Canal Flats, and had traveled the river as far as Revelstoke by that time. On their Big Bend part of the trip, they were guided by Bob Blackmore, who I mentioned in the story of the drowning of the local people, and Andy Kipson, who was a well-known miner and trapper and packer in the Bend as well. We actually have a copy of the book that they produced as a result of their trip. It's quite an interesting adventure story. I actually did a talk on their trip one time. I might repeat that. Again, they had some rather harrowing experiences going through the area between Big Bend, along the Big Bend between Golden and Revelstoke. They had graduation exercises at Queen Victoria Hospital at the end of October. And among the graduates were Ura Davis of Notch Hill, who became Mrs. Tick Fleming. And also in there is Annie Thomas from Ladysmith, Marjorie Gibson from Prince Rupert, and Harriet Marjorie Gibson. She later became the wife of Vincent Seeger, and Vera Nelson on the end, who became Vera Turnross. There was a sad note in November when local CPR trainman Harold Mulholland lost both of his legs in an accident at Boulder, just west of Revelstoke. It said he had just completed his duties at Boulder, the last stop prior to reaching Revelstoke, when through some unaccountable reason, the unfortunate young man fell between the cars. He was brought to Queen Victoria Hospital, cared for by Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Sutherland. He did survive. He went on to run a pool hall on First Street for many years, Mull's Pool Hall. And sons were Wally and Bud, who were quite well known in town. They had the Great War Veterans Association had their Armistice Day celebration on November 11th, and they did a vaudeville show and a dance. So it was more of a celebratory event than a remembrance as it is now. The provincial election was held on December 1st. The majority Liberal government was returned under John Oliver. There was actually no election in the Revelstoke riding because the local member, Dr. Sutherland, took his seat by acclamation. There was work going on the West Road continuing, and it said one of the biggest shots that was ever fired in the interior of BC was used on December 15th to displace 8,000 tons of rock at Victor Lake, 13 miles west of Revelstoke. Nearly 4 tons of black powder were used. The wash pulling down some 10 feet of gravel, the wash pulled down about 10 feet of gravel on the roadbed. They were planning a second blast for January 25th. And they were hoping by the end of the spring to complete the road to Three Valley. And then this is end of December. You could go into the local stores and get your Christmas shopping done. So our next brown bag history on January 22nd is the World War I internment camp on Mount Revelstoke. An interesting story. Also that day at 5 o'clock, we're having our annual general meeting of the Revelstoke Museum and Archives Association. So if you're a member, you're certainly welcome to come. If you're not a member, you're welcome to come as well and take out a membership if you wish. And then we're doing a fun little event on February 4th and calling it Chilean Buns and Ski History. So we're serving dinner and doing a talk on ski history, and it's $10 a person. We have tickets available downstairs for that. Anybody have any comments or questions?
One picture of near the front, the first one with the ski race on the street there. Wondered what you thought about the location of it.
You have 7 miles?
Knew the one before that.
This one? Yeah, I wasn't sure about that one. Did you have any ideas?
It almost looks like it's on this street here, but
That's what I thought, but it doesn't
that
quite
big
match up.
building in the far end there is just, even the Smythe building is not big.
No,
That's another one.
no, I'm not sure on that one either. I haven't, it's one of those I haven't quite figured out yet.
No.
Because I'm not sure, it doesn't look like Mackenzie. But they did start a lot of the races on Mackenzie.
Do you have any idea what the route was, where they went?
I don't think we do. I'd have to, I'm not sure if they published that or not.
Probably up the bend.
7 miles is a fair distance, so.
So,
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody.